Hi, everyone. Welcome to the monthly meeting of the Canadian Aviation Historical Society's Manitoba Chapter. We meet generally on the last Thursday of the month, either online by Zoom for anyone, or in Winnipeg at the Royal Aviation Museum of Western Canada. Membership in the chapter is free. You're welcome to attend in person or by Zoom. And if you attend in person, we take a silver collection, but that's for next month. The national organization, Canadian Aviation Historical Society, has been around now for 60 years. And for all that time, we have published a quarterly journal with great articles on various aspects of Canadian aviation history. And unusually, these articles are peer reviewed, so it's not just it's much more like an academic journal than a popular journal. You can join CAHS nationally for as little as $25. You go to the website, cahs.com, and join if you feel it's worthwhile. Our speaker tonight is Roger Gunn. Roger is an author. He's written a book on three famous Canadian pilots of the First World War, and I turn it over to Roger.
Oh, thank you very much. The last time I was presenting in front of you, I was talking about Alan McLeod, and that was back in January of 2022, I believe. Right. And today I'm going to be talking about Andrew Edward McKeever and Donald MacLaren. And so you're getting two presentations for the price of one. And hopefully it isn't a question of you get what you pay for. So let me talk about my book, Masters of the Air. It's by Dundurn, published by Dundurn, and is about those three gentlemen, McLeod, McKeever, and MacLaren. And it's available at your favorite bookstore. I understand that CAHS has a couple of copies available as well. And tonight I'll be talking about McKeever in the middle and Don MacLaren on the right. So this is my second book. The first book came out in 2013, Raymond Collishaw and the Black Flight, also published by Dundurn. So let's talk about Andy McKeever. Born August 21st, 1894 in Elma Township. Elma Township, right near the small town of Listowel in Ontario, just west of Toronto. He was one of 10 children. Now, at that time when he was born, his parents did not register him in the record of births. So after, I guess, 10 kids, you forget to register some of your kids. His dad was William McKeever, and he was a farmer. And his mother was Annabelle McKeever, née Henderson. So Andy McKeever worked on the family farm when he was growing up. And then he went to school in Listowel, both in the public system and the high school. He went to Listowel and then enrolled in the Central Business College in Toronto, just down the road. And he wanted to be an accountant and graduated as such, and then became a bank teller in Listowel. Now, also, he was interested in the militia. So at the age of 21, he joined the Queen's Own Rifles in Toronto and was a member of the Queen's Own Rifles for a year from 1950 to 1960. Now, some documents say that McKeever fought in the First World War with the Queen's Own. My research says that's incorrect. So he didn't go overseas with the Queen's Own. He enrolled with the Royal Flying Corps and was accepted into the Royal Flying Corps in November of 1960 and sailed on the Grampian and went to Liverpool. Now, once an accountant, always an accountant, he claimed for reimbursement for his travel from Listowel to England and only received partial reimbursement. And he took a train from Liverpool to London and claimed reimbursement for that leg of the journey as well. But unfortunately, he was not successful. He certainly was a penny pincher by the sounds of things. So unlike MacLeod and MacLaren, McKeever trained solely in England. So he was training in the School of Military Aeronautics in Oxford and was appointed a probationary second lieutenant, special reserve in the Royal Flying Corps in December 1916. And he flew old 1912 version Morris Farman Shorthorn and Longhorns. Now, these were planes, you may recall, the student pilot, or the trainee, was in the front in a nacelle, or a bathtub-looking affair, and the instructor pilot was behind him. And behind the instructor was the engine and the propeller. So it was a pusher aircraft, and the plane got pushed along by the engine and the prop facing the tail. So he flied those types of planes, and he learned all about the theory of flight and engine maintenance and rigging and all you need to know to be a pilot: meteorology, cross-country flying. And he not only flew the Shorthorn and Longhorn, but he was flying RE-8s, pejoratively called Harry Tates after an actor in a play in London at the time, BE-2Cs, and the new Bristol F-2A and B fighters. Now, those were fabulous aircraft. There's a picture of a Bristol fighter, and it's a two-seater, so it looks like only one scoop there at the top of the fuselage, but in fact, the pilot and the co-pilot was right beside each other, back to back. So they were very close. They were able to communicate to each other up in the air because they were literally back to back. So McKeever spent 4 months of training and then further training at Northolt in England in March of 17. So he finished his training from November to about March, and then went overseas later on in 1917. Now, when the Bristol fighter first came out, and first went into combat on April the 5th, 1917, the British pilots in 48 Squadron, thought it was to be flown like any other reconnaissance aircraft. Slow, steady, and straight. They encountered the Richthofen's flying circus, who made a mess of them. They were blasted out of the sky, and 4 of the Bristols were shot down by Richthofen's flying circus. Now, McKeever, on the other hand, flew the Bristol fighter, as a scout. He used the forward-firing machine gun, Vickers machine gun, and then his observer behind him covered his tail, to be polite, and with the Lewis gun. So he knew what the machine was capable of, and he was able to fly it in an extraordinary fashion. So McKeever joined up with 11 Squadron at the end of May 1917, and he was somewhat reserved. He was a big fellow. He was about 5 feet 10 inches tall. Didn't like to party all that much, and was a bit of a loner, but he was quite friendly and well kept, and kept to himself mainly. In any event, the squadron moved to La Bellevue in June of 1917 to be closer to the front lines. And by June of 1917, the whole squadron was re-equipped with the Bristol fighters. And McKeever made a name for himself. In June of 1917, June 20th, McKeever and his observer, Second Lieutenant Duncan, were attacked by an enemy Albatross, and McKeever shoots him down. I guess the Albatross thought, oh, here's a typical 2-seater reconnaissance plane, easy pickings, and no such luck. He was shot down. Now, he wasn't awarded a victory officially, but the next day he and a number of the Bristol fighters, short-form Brisfits, were attacked by an Albatross, and McKeever drives off the enemy aircraft. Doesn't shoot him down, but drives him off so that he goes away with his tail between his legs, kind of thing. Now, McKeever had a number of different observers: Duncan, Second Lieutenant Oak, and some others. On June the 26th, McKeever and his observer were attacked by 6 Albatrosses, or Albatross, I guess the plural of albatross is albatross. Anyway, McKeever bagged two enemy aircraft, and they were officially recognized as McKeever's first and second victories. So this is June. This is on mid-year of 1917. Now, most of the time, McKeever flew with Lieutenant Leslie Powell, a Brit from England. And in the 3 weeks between June 26th and July the 13th, Miss McKeever was victorious over 8 enemy aircraft, both either destroyed or DOOC, driven out of control. So he was awarded 8 enemy aircraft as victorious over 8 enemy aircraft, and won the the Military Cross. So as a result of that action in late June and early July, he won the. Now he was becoming well known in the squadron and was nicknamed Hawkeye because of his marksmanship skills. He was an excellent marksman. There's a picture of the Military Cross, beautiful medal. And that medal is today in the Listowel Legion, named the McKeever Legion. And that and his Distinguished Service Order can be found in the Legion. And I was lucky enough to be the guest speaker last November the 11th in the Listowel Legion as a speaker to recognize Remembrance Day. Quite an honor that I found. Well, in August and September of 1917, the streak continued. He mainly flew with Powell, as I mentioned, and on August the 5th, he shot down an enemy aircraft. And in fact, he was credited with 2 enemy machines being out of control. On the 22nd, he was flying with observer Ebert and encountered 2 flights of Albatross scouts. Now, McKeever was absolutely fearless. Whether it was 1 against 5 or 1 against 10, he'd attack the enemy scouts. He knew what his machine was capable of, and he knew that his observer Powell was an excellent marksman as well. So there they are, McKeever on the left and Powell on the right. Powell's a little taller than McKeever, a little older, in his late 20s, and McKeever was in his mid-20s. So in September, the streak continued, and during an offensive patrol, he encountered some enemy aircraft, and he was being followed by an Albatross, and he looped the loop and rolled, did an Immelman turn. He looped and rolled and came the other direction against the Albatross and shot him down. So that was a morning flight. In the afternoon, he bagged another one. And on September the 25th, McKeever and observer Dodd and the rest of the Bristol fighters, the F-2Bs, encountered a couple of German 2-seaters. Now, one of the not tricks, but one of the skills McKeever had was that he flew right up close to the other machine. And in this case, he was only 25 yards away and shot down the German 2-seater. He would get as close as possible, knowing that his machine guns would fire right in to the enemy machine. Now, on September the 28th, there was a flight of 4 Bristols, and they were escorting DH-5s. And they tangled with a number of Albatross. Anyway, we talked about the plural of Albatross. Anyway, well, 3 enemy aircraft were destroyed in the air, and 5 were seen driven down out of control. So 3 destroyed, 5 out of control. And McKeever was in the midst of all that activity, and in fact had 3 different patrols, 3 different flights that day, and downing an enemy aircraft for each of those flights. So by the end of September, McKeever's score, I hate to call it a score, but his total victories accumulated were 18. And his ability continued into October, November of 1917. McKeever piled up the victories, and so too did Powell. Powell ended the war with a total of 19 victories as an observer. So he was quite adept as an observer as well. So McKeever receives a bar to his MC, and Powell is awarded an MC as well. In the Battle of Cambrai in late November, Squadron Number 11 did not only reconnaissance and observation and photography work, they also did low-level strafing missions and bombing missions against the German infantry. On November the 30th, McKeever and Powell were flying a reconnaissance mission, and they spotted some enemy aircraft. And again, McKeever gets right up close to an enemy aircraft and plasters it with his machine guns. Now, they were trapped. It was a setup. The German two-seaters were just the bait. And when they took the bait, they were jumped by 7 Albatross machines. So Powell fired his Lewis gun and shot 2 down, and McKeever shot some down as well. But there were, 5 left after shooting a couple of planes down, and the dogfight went down and down and down as they reduced altitude. And at the end of the dogfight, McKeever plays a trick on the Germans. He was down to about 20 feet, shuts off his engine, and does a side slip. And he fooled the German aircraft because they thought, oh, he's a goner. His engine stopped. He's going to be crashing. And they left. They flew back to Germany. Well, what did McKeever do? He shut off. He turned his engine back on again and flew over the lines and came home. Now, his machine was riddled with holes from the enemy aircraft and from the ground fire, but he managed to come home safe and sound with his machine riddled with bullet holes. And for this action, McKeever was given the Distinguished Service Order. Powell was awarded a Distinguished Conduct Medal. So by the end of November, McKeever was credited with the destruction or the bringing down out of control of 27 aircraft. McKeever was the king of the two-seaters. Now, some historians have put it down to luck. I don't think so. He was a skilled pilot. He was a marksman, and he was fearless. Those were the qualities of an ace that became the king of the two-seaters. McKeever was so good that they wanted him to be a trainer, an instructor, so they sent him home for the last year of the war. 1918, he was in the home establishment. And in England, he was a trainer and had the rank of acting captain. On February the 23rd, 1918, he was invested by King George with the DSO and the MC and bar. Now, McKeever loved the pomp and ceremony, and being 5 feet 10 inches tall, he had to bend down quite a bit for the diminutive king to place the 2 medals on the chest of Andrew Edward McKeever. On April the 1st, 1918, McKeever was made a captain. That was the day that our Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service were merged into the RAF. He was granted some home leave and went back to Listowel for a hero's level. But that was a short leave, and he came back to England. And upon his return, towards the end of the war, there was talk about forming a Canadian Air Force, CAF. So Billy Bishop was in charge of hiring the people to run the Canadian Air Force, and he first approached Collishaw, and Collishaw was busy, so doing other things. So he went to McKeever and said, could you be squadron leader for Squadron 1 of fighters? Squadron 2 of bombers was run by the name of Walter Lawson. So 2 squadrons in the Canadian Air Force at that time, 1 for fighters, 1 for bombers. And they were established in Upper Heyford, Oxfordshire. So by the time the war is over, you can imagine that everybody wants to go home. And the CAF was having difficulty filling positions, including ground crew. They weren't paid properly or at all. They didn't get their leave, their messing and accommodation arrangements were horrible. And nobody really seemed to want to have a Canadian reference. And McKeever, as you can imagine, was frustrated by the lack of support from the Brits and by the Canadian government. The British offered the Canadian government free planes, and they gave them 30 or 40 planes. And the Canadian government said, sure, we'll take them. They shipped them off to Halifax, and the former RNAS pilot by the name of Nick Carter accepted them all. And McKeever was promoted to major at the beginning of 1919. But as I said, was frustrated by the lack of help by the Canadian government. And even after they, in March of 1919, they transferred to Shoreham by sea and were led by Major Robert Leckie, very famous Canadian pilot in his own right. But eventually the CAF was disbanded and McKeever was demobilized and back to Listowel in late August of 1919. And he brought his own brisket back home, he had his own brisket fighter. And he mounted a Lewis gun on the top wing of the airplane. However, there was a tragic ending to Andrew Edward McKeever on September the 2nd. He was a passenger in an old Hudson 6 automobile along with 2 other gentlemen and 3 women. And somehow the car skidded into the ditch. McKeever was the only one who was injured. He broke his leg. Now, can you imagine somebody who's been victorious over 27 enemy machines and never got a scratch except on the heel of his left foot? He got a bullet wound, just a scrape. And he's the one who was the only one in the 6 of them that was injured. He broke his leg in a civil car accident. So they toggled him off to the Stratford Hospital to set his leg, but it was not done properly. And he had to go to Toronto General Hospital to have the leg rebroken and reset properly. This was the end of December. And at first he was doing fine. By Thursday, he took a turn for the worst. And Major McKeever died Christmas Day, 1919, either from uremic poisoning or a blood clot in the brain. What a tragedy. This skilled pilot who had 27 victories is now dead. The town was in shock. Their favorite son and war hero had passed away. The funeral was held December 31st, 1919, and there were over 5,000 people in attendance. Ron was one of Canada's preeminent pilots. Life snuffed out too soon. There's the Fairview Cemetery today and his memorial. Andrew Edward McKeever's tombstone. And I'm told by the people of Listowel, since I was there last November the 11th, that they cleaned up the monument. Thank goodness it's not covered in moss anymore, and it is all cleaned up, which is great. So we shall remember people like Andrew Edward McKeever. They fought to preserve our democratic way of life. And we should remember them, and we shall remember them. Forever remain grateful. If you want, I can jump right into part 2 of my presentation on Donald MacLaren. So again, he's the fellow on the right-hand side of the book cover. And he was quite different than McKeever in a number of ways. Let me start out by saying he was born, first of all, in Ottawa, or the township of Ottawa, late May of 1893. Father Robert, mother Mary, and Don MacLaren's grandparents were Scottish settlers in the Pembroke area just west of Ottawa. So the MacLaren family in the late 1900 moved out to Calgary. And that's where MacLaren's upbringing was in Calgary. So here's the 1901 census. documents, and they list the MacLaren family. At that time, Robert was the husband, age 36. His wife was of the same age, married, and they had 3 kids. Abel, age 9, Don, 7, almost 8, and a younger brother, Roy, age 5. Well, you got the audio of the first part of my presentation. Now, here's the video. So he was born in Ottawa, as I mentioned, and they moved to Calgary in 1900. Here's a screenshot of the 1901 census, the 4th census of Canada, and the MacLarens are listed. 5 of them, Robert and Mary, the parents of Gable, Donald, and Roy. Now, Don attended public school in Calgary and attended the Western Canada College on 17th Avenue. And I believe that college is still there, if I'm not mistaken. That, at the time, was the outskirts of Calgary, and fields all around. And Don learned from his father how to shoot a gun. Robert was taught by his father, so he'd teach Donald how to shoot a gun, and presumably he taught Roy as well. The family was in Calgary for about 10 or 11 years, and then they moved to Vancouver just the year before the Calgary Stampede started in 1912. And having finished his public and high school, Donald MacLaren applied and was accepted to McGill University in Montreal. Now, I just found out the other day that he didn't go to Montreal for his studies. At the time, McGill University had a Vancouver campus. I didn't know that until just recently. And he studied mechanical engineering for a couple of years. Now, he left due to illness. I'm not quite sure what the illness was, but he recovered from the illness. He had to get out of university, and instead he took a surveying course. So he was a surveyor and a fur trader. His father and brother and he went to work in the forests, trapping furs at Keg River Prairie, which was 100 miles north of the nearest railway station, Peace River Crossing, way out in the wilderness in northern Alberta. And Don had to finish his studies in surveying and joined them later towards the end of 1914. In fall, he joined them. And neither his father or Don or Roy knew that the Great War had commenced in August of 1914. They were busy trapping furs, and they were in competition with the Hudson's Bay Company. Got to know the Inuit and Aboriginal people quite well, and made a great haul of furs at that time. So they trapped for 2 years, 1914 to 1916, and as I mentioned, didn't even know the war had begun. Donald also worked for the government of Alberta, doing survey work up in the north in the 1916. So it wasn't until 1916 that he returned to Vancouver to discover that his brother Roy had enlisted. And Don enlists as well. He first of all, he wanted to go into the Navy, but all the positions were full, so he enlisted into the Royal Flying Corps and was accepted into the Royal Flying Corps. And on May the 10th, he filled out his attestation papers. And Don was shorter than McKeever. Don was about 5 feet 6 inches tall. And in the attestation papers, it mentions any distinguishing marks, and it talks about a scar on the side of the head and another scar on the forehead. I wondered how he got these scars on his head, whether he was in a barroom brawl or was attacked by a grizzly or something like that, who knows. Probably not in a barroom brawl, because he was a teetotaler, never touched alcohol, never smoked. So probably the bear attack is the most big reason for the scars. In any event, they go in May 1917 to Toronto, and the University of Toronto had a School of Military Aeronautics at that time. And they learned all about engines, machine guns, signaling, and the use of panels, big sheets of cloth put on the ground to show what direction the aircraft was supposed to fly in. Now, they needed to have pass marks for all their exams, or else they sent back to the infantry and do more square bashing and marching and so on. So they had to do well, and Donald MacLaren did very well by all accounts. The teaching methods were quite basic. They were talking about engines and photography without actual engines there to work on and cameras to learn how to use. After the basic training, they went to Long Branch. And I might add that Alan McLeod is in the same class as Don MacLaren at this time. And at Long Branch, they went to the Curtis Aviation School. Now, anybody know about Glenn Hammond Curtis? Just a fascinating fellow who was a rival to the Wright brothers. And he started out as a motorcycle manufacturer and designer and won land speed records in the early 1900s in a motorbike. And when he invented his Curtis Jenny, Curtis won the Reims race in France for the fastest machine in the world at that time in 1989. So at Long Branch, Donald's first dual flight was June the 18th, 1970. His first solo flight was just a week later, June 23rd. He finished his training in Canada in Camp Borden. So the class was sent to Camp Borden to finish up their training and to work on their gunnery skills, their map reading, and to do cross-country flying and formation. And at that time, Camp Borden was just a bunch of sand dunes, and everyone was living in tents. So they got through Camp Borden training, and both MacLeod and MacLaren got on the SS Metagamma, and in August of 1917, sailed to England. And in England, they continued their training on a number of different aircraft, the Avro 504, DH-5s, Newports, Bristol Scouts, a number of different machines. And MacLaren, for the first time, soloed in Sopwith Camel. Now, the Sopwith Camel is probably the most famous plane of World War I. There's a picture of it right there. It was a difficult machine to fly because it had a rotary engine, and the whole engine turned in a clockwise direction, which automatically steered the machine to the right. So you had to apply a bit of left rudder to keep it going straight. But once you manage that, it was a joy to fly in there. So MacLaren joined Royal Flying Corps Squadron 46 went to France in early December of 1917. He flew out of Saint-Omer Aerodrome, and Donald was assigned to be a pilot in A flight. There he is there in Saint-Omer, young, early 20s, or mid-20s probably by then, by 1917. And his combat started in March. So in the first 3 months, from December to March, he was getting used to the front lines. He was figuring out where to fly, where not to fly. He was practicing his skills. And then his first victory came in March, where he shot down a two-seater reconnaissance machine. And from there, the victory started to pile up. So his first victory was March of 1918. Quarter of the way into the last year of the war. Well, so between March and November, MacLaren piled up quite a few victories. You'll recall that on March the 21st, the Germans launched their final push, the Michael Offensive. They wanted to roll up the enemy to the English Channel before the Americans came over in great numbers. And on the same day of the start of Operation Michael, MacLaren was in the air and he attacked, he and his flight attacked a long-range gun that was mounted on a railway car behind the lines. So with their 20-pound Cooper's bombs, the flight attacked this long-range gun, and MacLaren's bombs hit right on target and knocked out this artillery piece. He also got involved in strafing enemy infantry, and in fact, he shot down two German two-seaters on the way home and also destroyed an enemy balloon. So in one day, he shot down two two-seaters, an enemy balloon, and destroyed an artillery piece. Not bad for one day's work. And for that, he was awarded the Military Cross for that. At the end of March, he had destroyed 9 enemy machines and received the honor to the Military Cross. By the end of May 1918, MacLaren had shot down 15 German aircraft and 2 German balloons. So during the summer, his tally mounted even more. And by the end of September, MacLaren had bagged 52 enemy aircraft and a couple of enemy balloons. So in 201 flying days, he had shot down 47 enemy aircraft by the end of September. So that's about 1 every 4 days, and more if you include the tally of 52. Now, MacLaren's last victory took place on October the 9th, and his last flight was October the 18th. His total victories amounted to 54, including 6 enemy balloons. MacLaren placed 5th, if there is a ranking of pilots, British Empire pilots. He placed 5th in the number of victories. First, of course, was Edward Manock. Second, Billy Bishop. Third, Collishaw. Fourth, James Cudden. And MacLaren placed 5th of all the British Empire pilots in the whole war. He was the highest scoring Sopwith-Campbell pilot in the entire war. He destroyed more planes in the Sopwith-Campbell than any other pilot. Now, it's a funny story that he ended up breaking his ankle before the end of the war. He was in a wrestling match with one of his fellow pilots and ended up breaking his ankle. In fact, I think he was set up. It was a way to get him out of the war so that he didn't get shot down. He could be a long-living hero of the First War. Anyway, he went to England. He was hospitalized, and by the Armistice Day, November the 11th, he and his brother Roy celebrated. They were walking down Piccadilly Square with a couple of bottles of champagne under their arms and ready to party. After he recovered, both from the party and from his ankle injury, he went to work for the CAF, the Canadian Air Force. So Andy McKeever hired him to be the flight commander for one of the flights in Squadron Number 1. You'll recall that there was a Squadron 1 for fighters and a Squadron 2 for bombers. Eventually, however, the government ceased to support the CAF, and it ended its short life December of 1920. And then MacLaren resigned from his permanent commission on December the 1st, 1920. So returned to Vancouver in end of 1920. And for the first few years, MacLaren was trying to form a company of his own, and by 1925 had formed Pacific Airways in Vancouver. And they had a Curtis Jenny machine, and they also had what's called a Curtis HS2L, a somewhat larger type of Curtis Jenny, and they flew people around British Columbia and into the Yukon Territory. Now, in 1928, Pacific Airways was sold to its competitor, Western Canadian Airways, and MacLaren became the superintendent of the Western Division, or Pacific Coast Division, for Western Canada Airways. And at that time, they were being bought out in 1930. They were being bought out by Canadian Airways Limited, owned by the famous Richardson family, James Richardson of Winnipeg. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Richardsons of Winnipeg. And MacLaren was an employee working for James Richardson from 1930 to about 1937. And he was the assistant general manager for British Columbia and the Yukon, and was also involved in the mail run that was developed in the early 30s between Regina and Edmonton and Winnipeg and Calgary. So they had a number of, looking at my notes here, they had a number of beacon lights along the way on the ground every 15 miles, so that the pilots knew their way to get to the next airport, which had a searchlight as another navigational aid. That was the only navigational aids they had, beacons on towers and searchlight. In any event, that mail service was closed down in the early 30s by the government because it was the Great Depression, and they needed to save money. So Richardson and Canadian Airways Limited, they wanted to be the premier airlines in Canada, first coast-to-coast Canadian airlines. And they sent MacLaren to Ottawa to lobby the government, C.D. Howe and others, to form a Canadian-wide Canadian Airlines Limited. And MacLaren got to know C.D. Howe quite well, and he also knew all the MPs and partied with them. The best partiers were the French Canadian MPs, by the way. And he got to know a lot of the people who bent the ear of, MacLaren bent the ear of these MPs to try to get the Canadian government to agree to a Canada-wide airlines, which C.D. Howe agreed to, and by an act of Parliament in April 10, 1937, Trans-Canada Airlines came into existence. Unfortunately, not Richardson's Canadian Airlines Limited. So they withdrew their bid, and by an act of Parliament, the Trans-Canada Air started up with MacLaren as its first employee. Now, MacLaren had to get a hold of Richardson and say, hey, boss, they want me to be the first employee of this new airlines. Would you let me go? So Richardson, being the gentleman he was, he must have been pissed off. He agreed, and MacLaren became the first employee. And he served as assistant to the president, and served in that capacity until 1958. MacLaren had a number of different roles. He hired pilots. He designed hangars. He decided what make and model of radio to put in the aircraft. He did a lot of things. So he was quite involved in the operations of TCA until 1958, when he retired, and passed away at the ripe old age of 95, July the 4th, 1988. He's buried at the Mountain View Cemetery, and left a wife and daughter, Mrs. O.G. Gallagher, from Victoria. So here we have two completely different but similar Canadian pilots from World War I. Now, MacLaren, whenever he was interviewed in post-World War I, said, no, it's not the time to talk about my exploits in World War I. We have to talk about civil aviation. So he steered the conversation always to what he was doing in terms of civil aviation, not about the war. He didn't want to talk. That was passé. So both McKeever and MacLaren were excellent pilots, skilled marksmen, and very, very fearless. Thank you very much.